The Condemned by John Hobart Caunter. The assizes approached. Clifford's friends were numerous and influential, but in his case influence could be of no avail as a safeguard against the penalty of crime. He knew that if he were found guilty, he must suffer. His sole chance, therefore, was to silence that only evidence which could convict him. Against the oath of Esther Lutterell, nothing could prevail. Immense sums were consequently offered to purchase her silence, but she despised such sordid temptation. Every effort made to win her from her resolved and just purpose was unavailing. She turned with scornful indignation from the offered bribe. "No," said she, "he has ruined me. That I could forgive, because heaven might pardon that. But he has murdered my child. That heaven will never pardon, and I dare not. I will not, therefore, interpose betwixt the delinquent and his judge, when that delinquent deserves to die, and that judge is the delegate of one who is eternal. He has braved the penalty. Why then should he not suffer it? Let him die." The day of trial arrived. Clifford was brought into the dock. Alas, how changed! Terror had wrought fearful ravages upon a countenance which the most fastidious could not deny to be handsome. The blood seemed to have receded from every vein, while the blanched features told a fearful tale of sleepless nights and daily heart-burnings. A yellow tinge had usurped the usually transparent skin, while the whole countenance, gathered into one unvarying expression of subdued agony, appeared like an ivory head that had yielded up its primitive whiteness to the gradual spoliation of time. The change which a few short weeks had wrought was truly astonishing. He was scarcely to be recognized as the once robust, lively, thoughtless Clifford. Days seemed to have been converted into years. His hair had become thin, and hung in straggling tresses on his pallid temples, which were deeply indented with the lines of acute suffering. His nose was sharp and shrunk, his eyes were sunk and hollow, his cheeks rigid, his jaws fallen, and his lips so attenuated that when closed the mouth was only indicated by a strong curved line. He sighed deeply, and the hurried glance which he every now and then threw around the court showed how busy were the enemies of his peace within him. A tear of sympathy gathered in the eyes of many of the spectators, when they beheld the altered aspect of the man whose person but a few weeks before had been the envy of many and the admiration of all. What a tyrant is guilt when her slaves crouch beneath her scourge. The trial commenced. Clifford was near fainting several times during the opening address of the opposing counsel, and when he heard the dreadful charge announced that he was the murderer of his own child, he fell senseless upon the beam which separated him from that part of the court appropriated to the spectators. He was, however, soon restored to a consciousness of his awful situation, and was furnished with a glass of water at his own request, which he swallowed with the most painful eagerness. Several times during the opening speech he was near falling. He continued, however, to retain his senses to the conclusion, when the prosecutor was ushered into court. Every eye was fixed upon the witness box. After a short pause, Esther entered with a firm step and a serene, unembarrassed air. Nevertheless, as soon as she was ready to be examined, the momentary quiver of her lip and the transient flush upon her ashy cheek showed that all was not at rest within. Her bosom heaved quick and heavily, but her self-command, evidently amid the most violent inward struggles, was truly surprising. She lost not her composure a single instant. Her clear dark eye had in it an expression of lofty determination, blended nevertheless with a dignified respect, which excited the admiration of the whole court. Every person present felt a lively interest in her welfare, but in proportion as their sympathies were excited towards her, they were weakened towards her seducer. The contrast between them was remarkable. She stood before them in the severe dignity of her beauty, he in the untimely wreck of his. In her the hand of sorrow had shaded, but not eclipsed it. In him the scourge of terror and the stings of remorse had marred it altogether. Although she had become the dupe of his artifice, and suffered the penalty of her frailty, he nevertheless had been the greater victim, for while she had been the prey of another's guilt, he had fallen a victim to his own. It must be confessed, she rejoiced that retribution had overtaken him. Her wrongs were too great to be easily forgiven. They had seared her sympathies. They had extinguished her woman's tenderness. Upon entering the box, Esther made a slight inclination of the head to the presiding judge, and then fixed her eye placidly but keenly upon the examining advocate. She exhibited no symptoms of timidity, but stood before him with an air of such settled collectedness that he seemed rather disconcerted, as he cast towards her a glance of somewhat equivocal inquiry, and found it repelled by a quiet but indignant frown. She, like the prisoner, was dressed in the deepest mourning, which strikingly contrasted with the transparent whiteness of her beautiful countenance. Her hair was withdrawn from her forehead, and she wore neither cap nor bonnet, so that the whole face was conspicuously exposed, and every expression therefore visible to the spectators. She looked not pale from sickness, nevertheless she was pale, while in her tall but round and well-proportioned form there was a delicacy and ease of motion, at the same time a sustained elevation in her whole deportment, which soon expelled those favourable sentiments at first awakened for the wretched Clifford, and excited in every bosom a feeling bordering upon detestation towards him as the seducer of so much loveliness. As soon as she appeared before the court, Clifford shrunk before the object of his base perfidy, as if conscience-stricken at the unfavourable impression which he saw she was but too likely to excite against him. The blood rushed for a moment into his cheeks with a most distressing impetuosity, spreading there a deep purple suffusion, but immediately left it, when the skin resumed its dull parchment hue, while the quivering eyelid closed over the sunken orb beneath it, as if to shut out at once from his view the world and its miseries. He listened with breathless anxiety to the evidence which was to decide his doom. It was brief but decisive. In a distinct tone, which was low but neither feeble nor tremulous, Esther denounced Clifford as the murderer of her infant, by stabbing it in the breast with a knife. The knife was produced in court, and she swore to it as the same with which the prisoner at the bar had inflicted the fatal stab that deprived her of her babe. Her testimony could not be overthrown, and evidently made a strong impression upon the hearers. Clifford did not once raise his eyes whilst she was delivering it, but the convulsive twitches of his countenance plainly denoted what was passing within him. Esther seemed studiously to avoid turning her face towards him, as if she was determined not to be diverted from her purpose by the silent appeals which suffering naturally makes to our sympathies and our compassion. She was most severely cross-examined by the counsel for the defense. Nevertheless, with all his legal acuteness, he could not impeach the integrity of her evidence. Her answers were brief but unembarrassed, the facts which she had to communicate few but conclusive. When she had retired, Clifford was asked if he had anything to offer in his defense. He was dreadfully agitated, but after a short pause recovered himself sufficiently to address the court. He spoke as follows. My lord, and gentlemen of the jury, I have but few words to say, and as I hope for mercy from that eternal judge, before whom, if I am convicted upon this atrocious charge, I must soon appear, those words will record the truth. It is not likely that, standing in the fearful position in which I now do, I should rashly run the hazard of going into the presence of him who is the dispenser of justice as well as of mercy, with a lie upon my lips and with its taint upon my soul. Let this then be with you the pledge of my integrity. The witness whom you have just heard is forsworn. However cunningly falsehood may be disguised in the garb of simplicity, It is not, therefore, the less falsehood because it is so disguised. If I am condemned, I shall have become its victim. The following are the facts which the prosecutor has so atrociously endeavored to turn to my undoing. At her own request I met her, on the night mentioned in her evidence, on the spot where the supposed murder was committed, for which I now stand arraigned before you. After reproaching me with her ruin, she affected to desire a reconciliation, and to part from me in peace. She held her babe before me, and entreated for it a father's blessing. I pronounced in the overflowing sincerity of my heart the paternal benediction. At this moment the child, which had been for some time in ill health, became suddenly convulsed. I snatched a penknife from my pocket to cut the string of its dress, when the mother, in the agitation of her alarm, stumbled, thus forcing the infant against the knife, which instantly penetrated its side. I recoiled with consternation at the accident, but she, wildly screaming, forced the little sufferer into my arms, streaming with its blood, alarmed the neighboring cottagers, and taxed me as its murderer. These are the simple facts, and upon their truth I stake my soul's eternal security. I am the victim of a disappointed woman's vengeance. This address awakened no compassion for the unhappy man. On the contrary, it excited a murmur of indignation through the whole assembly. His countenance instantly fell as this token of popular feeling jarred upon his ear. The testimony of Esther had been supported by strong circumstantial evidence. The judge at length summed up, and the jury, without quitting the court, found the prisoner guilty. Upon hearing this fatal verdict, the wretched man fell back into the dock insensible. Esther, whose ear it had reached, for she was standing near the jury box, after having long struggled with her emotions, was now so entirely overcome by them that when sentence of death had been passed upon the unhappy Clifford, she sank upon the floor in convulsions, and in this pitiable state was taken from the court by her afflicted mother. Clifford was now put into one of the condemned cells, and clothed in the coarse habit assigned to those who have forfeited their lives to the outraged laws of their country. He had only 3 days to prepare his soul for eternity. What a term for a wretch so immersed in sin, to prepare to meet his omnipotent judge. Was there no escape? None. The court had denied him all hopes upon earth, and what had he beyond? What but a prospect too black even for the imagination of despair? Nothing can be imaged to the mind so fearful as the reflections of a man about to be launched upon the illimitable ocean of eternity, with such a burden of unexpiated sins upon his soul as a forced penitence cannot remove, and standing upon the very verge of his awful destiny, looking through the microscopic perspective of his imagination into a near prospect of undefinable horrors. We have seen, indeed, instances of criminals who have met their doom with that stern obduracy of spirit which has enabled them to smile at the dreadful array of death, and curse the very omnipotent before whose august presence they were about to appear. Shall we imagine, however, that because the tongue blasphemed, and the countenance could assume a smile, when the shaft of death was on the wing, the heart was at peace? No. Whatever may be the influence of a daring resolution upon the body, it cannot stifle the tortures of the spirit. The latter may be agonized and writhe under pangs too frightful for contemplation, when the former seems not to suffer. With Clifford, however, the keen scourge of remorse had visited both with its terrible inflictions. He could look nowhere for comfort, nowhere for peace. He now, indeed, clung to the consolations of religion, but they offered no consolation to him. He was to die, not the death of the righteous man, but of the condemned, the degraded criminal. He was to perish, not in hope, but in abandonment, not a repentant prodigal, but a rejected rebel. How willingly would he now make reparation to the injured Esther for the wrongs he had heaped upon her, but it was too late. Alas, that he could recall the past, how different should be the tenor of his future life. This conclusion was wrung from him by his terrors, but past recollections, in spite of his now bitter contrition, poured through his bosom a tide of the most agonizing emotions. Now the stings of conscience were felt, tipped with all their poisons. Remorse let loose her scorpions within him, which clung to and preyed upon his lacerated heart. The veriest wretch in the dark dungeon of the Inquisition, groaning under his lately inflicted tortures, and anticipating the future rack, was a happy being, compared to him who had no better prospect than the endurance of sufferings that must be forever, and shall be as great as they are illimitable. The morning appointed for the execution at length dawned, but Clifford's preparation for another world was no further advanced than when he had received the warning that his term of life was fixed. He had been too much engrossed by his terrors to allow him sufficiently to abstract his mind from the awfulness of the situation, and to repose his hopes upon that divine mercy which is denied to none who seek it with the right disposition of soul, even in the hour of their extremity. He could not seek it. He could not crush the worm within, and he already seemed to feel that it would never die. It had a fearful vitality which worked upon every fibre of his frame and reached even the impassive spirit. His hopelessness increased as the awful period drew nigh which was to terminate his earthly pilgrimage. He had no resource in reflection. His bosom was a volcano, which the lava of burning thought violently overflowed, streaming its scorching fires through every avenue of perception, and giving him, while yet upon the threshold of eternity, a terrible foretaste of hell. Upon the fatal morning when his sentence was to be fulfilled, he rose from a feverish sleep, and threw himself upon his knees in agony. He could not pray. He had committed no prayer to memory, and his mind was in too wild a state of conflict with his terrors to enable him to frame one. He supplicated his God to have mercy upon him, but this was all the prayer he could offer up. The bell at length tolled the hour, when he was, according to the terms of his sentence, to be taken from his cell to the place of execution, there to expiate his crime by the forfeiture of his life. He was conducted to the press room. His legs scarcely supported him, and he was obliged to avail himself of the assistance of one of the turnkeys, or he would have fallen. He seated himself upon a low bench, in a state bordering upon absolute stupefaction, whilst his irons were knocked off and his hands bound preparatory to his execution. He could scarcely articulate intelligibly in consequence of the excited state of his mind. While the preparations for the last eventful scene of his life were in progress, Clifford, whose eyes had been closed in a paroxysm of mental excitation, heard his name pronounced in a low but distinct tone, and suddenly looking up, beheld the wretch Esther beside him. She had undergone a considerable change in her appearance within the last 3 days. She now looked pale and haggard. There was a dark crimson spot on each cheek, but every other part of her countenance was colourless. The clear whiteness of her skin had assumed the sickly hue of disease. It was dull and sallow. The lustre of her eye, though still bright, had considerably faded, yet there was in it at intervals that same stern expression of resolved purpose which she had so frequently exhibited during the late trial, and which renewed in the bosom of the terrified criminal feelings little likely to soothe the desperate agonies of his heart. She approached him firmly. He shrunk from her as he would have shrunk from a herald of the pestilence. "Clifford," said she at length, "my prophecy is about to be accomplished. The day of retribution is arrived. You are about to go where the prisoners rest together and hear not the voice of the oppressor. Let us part in peace." Clifford gasped. He spoke not, but turned from her with a convulsive shudder. A tear gathered into her eye and rolled silently down her cheek. She, however, dashed it aside, and in an instant regained her self-possession. "I pity thee," she resumed, "but there are crimes of which it were criminal even to seek to remit the penalty. I confess, too, that it is a dear though painful satisfaction to me to witness the author of my everlasting shame the victim of his own misdeeds, and if at this moment I could pluck thee from the scaffold, still I would withhold from thee the arm of succour. Thou deservest to die. 1,000 lives were all too little to atone for the wrongs which thou hast done me. Make thy peace with heaven, for the fearful day of audit is at hand. May God forgive thee." The procession was now ordered to move towards the drop, and Esther was in consequence obliged to quit the prison. She left the press room, made her way through the crowd which had collected outside the walls, and placed herself almost immediately under the drop, whence she could obtain a perfect view of the execution, as if she anticipated a horrible satisfaction in witnessing the dying struggles of that man who had rendered her condition in this world one of unmitigated misery, and perhaps prepared for her one still more miserable in a world eternal. The vehement exacerbations with which she was struggling were but too visible to those around her. Their attention, however, was soon called to those more arresting objects which they had assembled to behold. Her breath came from her lungs in quick spasmodic gaspings, while the blood was forced into her very forehead by the violence of the conflict within her. Yet she uttered not a cry. Resolve was still written legibly in every lineament of her quivering countenance. She made a desperate effort to be composed, and in part succeeded. A slight tremor of the lip, and a faint hurried catching of the breath, less audible than a lover's whisper, were the only indications of those active fermentations of emotion which were busy within her bosom. The prisoner was now brought out, and appeared upon the drop, but so completely was he overcome that he was obliged to be carried up the ladder to the platform. He was supported while the executioner adjusted the cord, looking rather like a thing snatched from the grave, and into which the spark of animation had been just struck, than a creature in which that spark was about to be extinguished, and which the grave was ready to enclose. The foam oozed from the corners of his mouth, while the thin fear forced its way through the closed lids, fearfully denoting the horrors which were darting their 1,000 stings into his affrighted soul. There was a death-like stillness among the crowd. Not a sound was heard, save the occasional sigh of sympathy or the sob of pity, whilst the awful preparations were made previous to withdrawing the fatal bolt. All this while Esther kept her eye fixed, with anxious earnestness, upon the platform. The preparations were at length completed, and the cap drawn over the eyes of the criminal. Expectation had become so painfully intense among the crowd that their very breathings were audible. The bolt was now about to be withdrawn, when a voice was heard from among the assembled multitude. "He is innocent! I am forsworn!" Every eye was directed towards the spot. The speaker had fallen to the earth. It was Esther. She was lifted up, but no sign of animation appeared in her now ghastly features. She was instantly taken to a neighboring surgeon, but no blood followed the lancet. She was dead. The sheriff happened to be on the spot, and immediately ordered the execution to be suspended until more tangible evidence should be obtained. In the pocket of the unhappy girl, whom Clifford had so cruelly abandoned, was found a written confession which confirmed in every particular what he had declared upon his trial. He was immediately respited, and eventually released, yet the blight of infamy was upon him. He was given back indeed to existence, but his peace of mind was gone. His life was inglorious, still not without fruit. It was a sombre and a checkered scene. He had been stunned by the shock to which he had so nearly fallen a victim. He had reaped the bitter harvest of seduction. All his bright prospect had been blasted. He resolved, therefore, that the rest of his days should be spent in making atonement for the past, and preparing for that future which is eternal. He lived an outcast, but died a penitent.